"Sir," said Aximand, kneeling before the weeping War Master. "I failed him," said Horus. "I failed them all. I should have listened, but I didn't. And now they're all dead. It's too much." "Sir, we're going to get you out of here. The dead things have stopped attacking. We don't know how long that's going to last, so we need to get out of this place and regroup." Horus shook his head slowly. "They won't be attacking again. Temba's dead, and I cut the Vox signal. I don't know how exactly, but I think it was part of what was animating those poor souls." Abaddon pulled Loken aside and hissed, "We need to get him out of here, and we can't let anyone see the state he's in." Loken knew that Abaddon was right. To see the War Master like this would break the spirit of every Astartes who saw him. The War Master was an invincible god of war, a towering figure of legend that could never be brought low. To see him humbled so would be a blow to morale that the 63rd Expedition might never recover from. Gently, they prized Yugen Temba's massive body away from the War Master and lifted their commander to his feet. Loken slung the War Master's arm over his shoulder, feeling a warm wetness against his face from the blood that still dripped from Horus's arm. Between them, he and Abaddon walked the War Master from the bridge. "Wait," said the War Master, his voice weak and low. "I'll walk out of this place on my own." Reluctantly, they let him go, and though he swayed a little, the War Master kept his feet, despite the ashen pallor of his face and the obvious pain he was in. The War Master spared a last look at Yugen Temba and said, "Gather up Verulam, and let's get out of here, my sons." Maggard slumped against the steel bulkhead of the Glory of Terror, his sword covered in black fluids from the dead things. Petronella fought to hold back tears at the thought of how close they had all come to death on this bleak, emperor-forsaken moon. Sheltered behind the bulkhead where Maggard had thrust her, she had heard rather than seen the desperate conflict that raged outside, the war cries, the sound of motorized blades tearing into wet meat, the percussive booms and explosive flashes of light from the Titan's weapons. Her imagination filled in the blanks, and though a gut-loosening terror filled her from head to toe, she pictured glorious combats and heroic duels between the towering Astartes giants and the corrupt foes that sought their destruction. Her breathing came in short, convulsive gasps as she realized she had just survived her first battle. But with that realization came a strange calm. Her limbs stopped shaking, and she wanted to smile and laugh. She wiped her hand across her eyes, smearing the coal that lined them across her cheeks like tribal war paint. Petronella looked over at Maggard, seeing him now for the great warrior he truly was, barbaric and bloody, and magnificent. She pushed herself to her feet and leaned out beyond her sheltering bulkhead to look at the battlefield below. It was like a scene from one of Keelan Roget's landscapes, and the sublime vision took her breath away. The fog and mist had lifted, and the sun was already breaking through to bathe the landscape in its ruddy red glow. The pools of swamp water glittered like shards of broken glass spread across the landscape. The three magnificent titans of the Legio Mortis watched over squads of Astartes, armed with flamers, putting the corpses of the dead things to the torch, and pyres of the fallen monsters burned with a blue-green light. She was already forming the metaphors and imagery she would use, the Emperor's warriors taking his light into the dark places of the galaxy, or perhaps that the Astartes were his angels of death, bringing his retribution to the unrighteous. The words had the right epic tone, but she sensed that such imagery still lacked some fundamental truth, sounding more like propaganda slogans than anything else. This was what the Great Crusade was all about, and the fear of the last few hours was washed away in a swelling wave of admiration for the Astartes and the men and women of the 63rd Expedition. She turned as she heard heavy footfalls. The officers of the Mournival were marching towards her, a plate-armored body borne upon their shoulders, and the levity she had witnessed in them earlier, now utterly absent. Each one's face, even the Joker Torgadon's, was serious and grim. The cloaked figure of the War Master himself followed behind them, and she was shocked rigid at his beaten appearance. His armour was torn and gashed with foulness, and blood spatters matted his face and arm.
"What happened?"
she asked as Captain Loken passed her.
"Whose body is that?"
"Be silent," he snapped, "and be gone." "No," said the War Master. "She is my documentarist, and if that is to mean anything, then she must see us at our worst, as well as our best." "Sir," began Abaddon, but Horus cut him off. "I'll not be argued with on this, Ezekiel. She comes with us." Petronella felt her heart leap at this inclusion, and fell into step with the War Master's party as they began their descent to the ground. "The body is that of Verulam Moy, captain of my 19th Company," said Horus, his voice weary and filled with pain. "He fell in the line of duty, and will be honoured as such."
"You have my deepest sorrows, my lord,"
said Petronella, her heart aching to see the War Master in such pain.
"Was it Eugen Tember?"
she asked, fishing out her data slate and Nemo quill.
"Did he kill Captain Moy?"
Horus nodded, too weary even to answer her.
"And Tember is dead? You killed him?"
"Eugen Tember is dead," answered Horus. "I think he died a long time ago. I don't know exactly what I killed in there, but it wasn't him."
"I don't understand."
"I'm not sure I do either," said Horus, stumbling as he reached the bottom of the slope of debris. She reached out a hand to steady him before realizing what a ridiculous idea that was. Her hand came away bloody and wet, and she saw that the War Master still bled from a wound in his shoulder. "I ended the life of Eugen Tember, but damn me if I didn't weep for him afterwards."
"But wasn't he an enemy?"
"I have no trouble with my enemies, Miss Fever," said Horus. "I can take care of my enemies in a fight. But my so-called allies, my damned allies, they're the ones who keep me walking the floors at night." Legion apothecaries made their way towards the War Master as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. She allowed the Nemo quill to inscribe his words anyway. She saw the look she was getting from the Mournival, but ignored them.
"Did you speak to him before you slew him? What did he say?"
He said that only I had the power to stop the future, said the War Master, his voice suddenly faint and echoing as though coming from the other end of a long tunnel. Puzzled, she looked up in time to see the War Master's eyes roll back in their sockets and his legs buckle beneath him. She screamed, reaching out with her hand towards him, knowing that she was powerless to help him, but needing to try to prevent his fall. Like a slow-moving avalanche or a mountain toppling, the War Master collapsed. The Nemo quill scratched at the data slate, and she wept as she read the words there. "I was there the day that Horus fell." 9. Silver Towers. A Bloody Return. The veil grows thin. From here, he could see the pyramid roof of the Athenaeum, the low evening sun reflecting on its gold panels as if it were ablaze. And even though Magnus knew he used but a colourful metaphor, the very idea gave him a pang of loss. To imagine that vast repository of knowledge lost in the flames was abhorrent, and he turned his cyclopean gaze from the pyramid of crystal glass and gold. Tizca, the so-called City of Light, stretched out before him, its marble colonnades and wide boulevards tree-lined and peaceful. Soaring towers of silver and gold reared above a city of gilded libraries, arched museums and sprawling seats of learning. The bulk of the city was constructed of white marble and gold-veined ooslite, shining like a bejeweled crown in the sun. Its architecture spoke of a time long past, its buildings shaped by craftsmen who had honed their trades for centuries under the tutelage of the Thousand Suns. From his balcony on the Pyramid of Photep, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, contemplated the future of Prospero. His head still hurt from the ferocity of the nightmare, and his eye throbbed painfully in its enlarged socket. He gripped the marble balustrade of the balcony trying to wish away the visions that assailed him in the night and now chased him into the daylight. Mysteries of the night were revealed in the light of day, but these visions of darkness could not be dragged out so easily. For as long as Magnus could remember, he had been cursed and blessed with a measure of foresight, and his allegorical interpretation of the Athenaeum ablaze troubled him more than he liked to admit. He poured himself some wine from a silver pitcher, rubbing a copper-skinned hand through his mane of fiery red hair. The wine helped dull the ache in his heart as well as his head, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. Events were now in motion that he had the power to shape, and though much of what he had seen was madness and turmoil and made no sense, he could make out enough to know that he had to make a decision soon, before events spiraled out of control. Magnus turned from the view over Tisca and made his way back inside the pyramid, pausing as he caught sight of his reflection in the gleaming silver panels. Huge and red-skinned, Magnus was a towering giant with a lustrous mane of red hair. His patrician features were noble and just, his single eye golden and flecked with crimson. Where his other eye would have sat was blank and empty, though a thin scar ran from the bridge of his nose to the edge of his cheekbone. Cyclopean Magnus, they called him, or worse. Since their inception, the 1,000 Suns had been viewed with suspicion for embracing powers that others were afraid of. Powers that, because they were not understood, were rejected as being somehow unclean. Rejected ever since the Council of Nicaea. Magnus threw down his goblet, angry at the memory of his humbling at the feet of the Emperor, when he had been forced to renounce the study of all things sorcerous for fear of what he might learn. Such a notion was surely ridiculous, for was his father's realm not founded on the pursuit of knowledge and reason? What harm could study and learning do? Though he had retreated to Prospero and sworn to renounce such pursuits, the planet of the sorcerers had one vital attribute that made it the perfect place for such studies. It was far from the prying eyes of those who said he dabbled with powers beyond his control. Magnus smiled at the thought, wishing he could show his persecutors the things he had seen, the wonders and the beauty of what lived beyond the veil of reality. Notions of good and evil fell by the wayside next to such power as dwelled in the warp, for they were the antiquated concepts of a religious society, long cast aside. He stooped to retrieve his goblet, and filled it once more before returning to his chambers and taking a seat at his desk. Inside it was cool, and the scent of various inks and parchments made him smile. The wide chamber was walled with bookshelves and glass cabinets, filled with curios and remnants of lost knowledge gleaned from conquered worlds. Magnus himself had penned many of the texts in this room, though others had contributed to this most personal of libraries. Phocis Takar, Ahriman, and Uthizar, to name but a few. Knowledge had always been a refuge for Magnus, the intoxicating thrill of rendering the unknown down to its constituent parts and, by doing so, rendering it knowable. Ignorance of the universe's workings had created false gods in man's ancient past, and the understanding of them was calculated to destroy them. Such was Magnus's lofty goal. His father denied such things, kept his people ignorant of the true powers that existed in the galaxy, and though he promulgated a doctrine of science and reason, it was naught but a lie, a comforting blanket thrown over humanity to shield them from the truth. Magnus had looked deep into the warp, however, and knew different. He closed his eye, seeing again the darkness of the corrupt chamber, the glitter sheen of the sword, and the blow that would change the fate of the galaxy. He saw death and betrayal, heroes and monsters. He saw loyalty tested and found wanting and standing firm in equal measure. Terrible fates awaited his brothers and, worst of all, he knew that his father was utterly ignorant of the doom that threatened the galaxy. A soft knocking came at his door, and the red-armored figure of Ahriman entered, holding before him a long staff topped with a single eye.
"Have you decided yet, my lord?" asked his chief librarian, without preamble.
"I have, my friend," said Magnus. "Then shall I gather the coven?" "Yes," sighed Magnus. "In the catacombs beneath the city. Order the thralls to assemble the conjunction, and I shall be with you presently." "As you wish, my lord," said Ahriman. "Something troubles you?" asked Magnus, detecting an edge of reticence in his old friend's tone. "No, my lord. It is not my place to say." "Nonsense. If you have a concern, then I give you leave to voice it." "Then may I speak freely?" "Of course," nodded Magnus. "What troubles you?" Ahriman hesitated before answering. "This spell you propose is dangerous, very dangerous. None of us truly understand its subtleties, and there may be consequences we do not yet foresee." Magnus laughed. "I've not known you shirk from the power of a spell before, Ahriman. When manipulating power of this magnitude, there will always be unknowns, but only by wielding it can we bring it to heel. Never forget that we are the masters of the warp, my friend. It is strong, yes, and great power lives within it, but we have the knowledge and means to bend it to our will, do we not?" "We do, my lord," agreed Ahriman. "Why then do we use it to warn the Emperor of what is to come, when he has forbidden us to pursue such matters?" Magnus rose from his seat, his copper skin darkening in anger. "Because when my father sees that it is our sorcery that has saved his realm, he will not be able to deny that what we do here is important, nay, vital to the Imperium's survival." Ahriman nodded, fearful of his Primarch's rage, and Magnus softened his tone. "There is no other way, my friend. The Emperor's palace is warded against the power of the warp, and only a conjuration of such power will breach those wards." "Then I will gather the coven immediately," said Ahriman. "Yes, gather them, but await my arrival before beginning. Horus may yet surprise us." Panic, fear, indecision. 3 emotions previously unknown to Loken seized him as Horus fell. The War Master crashed to the ground in slow motion, splashing into the mud as his body went completely limp. Shouts of alarm went up, but a paralysis of inaction held those closest to the War Master tightly in its grip, as though time itself had slowed. Loken stared at the War Master lying on the ground before him, inert and corpse-like, unable to believe what he was seeing. The rest of the Mournival stood similarly immobile, rooted to the spot in disbelief. He felt as though the air had become thick and cloying, the cries of fear that spread outwards echoing and distant, as though from a hollow picture running too slow. Only Petronella Vivas seemed unaffected by the inaction that held Loken and his brothers firm. Down on her knees in the mud next to the War Master, she was weeping and wailing at him to get back up again. The knowledge that his commander was down, and a mortal woman had reacted before any of the sons of Horus, shamed Loken into action, and he dropped to one knee alongside the fallen Horus. "Apothecary!" shouted Loken, and time snapped back with a crash of shouts and cries. The Mournival dropped to the ground beside him. "What's wrong?" demanded Abaddon. "Commander!" shouted Torgadon. "Lupercal!" cried Aximand. Loken ignored them and forced himself to focus. "This is a battlefield injury, and I will treat it as such," he thought. He scanned the War Master's body as the others put their hands on him, pushing the Remembrancer out of the way as each struggled to wake their lord and master. Too many hands were interfering, and Loken yelled, "Stop! Get back!" The War Master's armor was beaten and torn, but Loken could see no other obvious breaches in the armored plates, save where the shoulder guard had been torn away, and where the gaping puncture wound oozed in his chest. "Help me get his armor off!" he shouted. The Mournival, bound together as brothers, nodded and, grateful to have a focus for their efforts, instantly obeyed Loken's command. Within moments they had removed Horus's breastplate and pauldrons and were unstrapping his remaining shoulder guard. Loken tore off his helmet and cast it aside, pressing his ear to the War Master's chest. He could hear the War Master's hearts pounding in a deathly slow double beat. "He's still alive!" he cried. "Get out of the way!" shouted a voice behind him, and he turned to rebuke this newcomer before seeing the double helix caduceus symbol on his armor plates. Another apothecary joined the first, and the Mournival was unceremoniously pushed aside as they went to work, hissing narthecium stabbing into the War Master's flesh. Loken stood watching them, impotent and helpless as they fought to stabilize the War Master. His eyes filled with tears, and he looked around in vain for something to do, something to make him feel he was helping. There was nothing, and he felt like crying out to the heavens for making him so powerful, and yet so useless. Abaddon wept openly, and to see the first captain so unmanned made Loken's fear for the War Master all the more terrible. Aximand watched the apothecaries work with a grim stoicism, while Torgadon chewed his bottom lip and prevented the Remembrancer from getting in the way. The War Master's skin was ashen, his lips blue, and his limbs rigid, and Loken knew that they must destroy whatever power had felled Horus. He turned and began marching back towards the glory of Terra, determined that he would take the stricken craft apart piece by piece if need be. "Captain," called one of the apothecaries, a warrior Loken knew as Vadon. "Get a Stormbird here now! We need to get him to the Vengeful Spirit!" Loken stood immobile, torn between his desire for vengeance and his duty to the War Master. "Now, Captain!" yelled the apothecary, and the spell was broken. He nodded dumbly and opened a channel to the captains of the Stormbirds, grateful to have a purpose in this maelstrom of confusion. Within moments, one of the medical craft was inbound, and Loken watched, mesmerized, as the apothecaries fought to save the War Master. He could see from the frantic nature of their ministrations that they were fighting an uphill battle, their Narthesium whirring miniature centrifuges of blood and dispensing patches of sin skin to treat his wounds. Their conversations passed over him, but he caught the odd familiar word here and there. "Laraman cells ineffective. Hypoxic poisoning." Aximand appeared at his side and placed his hand on Loken's shoulder. "Don't say it, little Horus," warned Loken. "I wasn't going to, Garfield," said Aximand. "He'll be all right. There's nothing this place could throw at the War Master that'll keep him down for long." "How do you know?" asked Loken, his voice close to breaking. "I just do. I have faith." "Faith?" "Yes," answered Aximand. "Faith that the War Master is too strong and too stubborn to be brought low by something like this. Before you know it, we'll be his war dogs once again." Loken nodded as the howling downdraft of a Stormbird snatched his breath away. The screaming craft hovered overhead, throwing up sheets of water as it circled on its descent. Landing skids deployed, and the craft came down amid a spray of muddy water. Before it had touched down, the Mournival and apothecaries had lifted Horus between them. Even as the assault ramp came down, they were rushing inside, placing the War Master on one of the gurneys as the Stormbird's jets fired to lift it from Davin's moon. The assault ramp clanged shut behind them, and Loken felt the aircraft lurch as the pilot aimed it for the skies. The apothecaries hooked the War Master up to Medicae machines, jamming needles and hissing tubes into his arms, and placing a feed line of oxygen over his mouth and nose. Suddenly superfluous, Loken slumped into one of the armored bucket seats against the fuselage of the aircraft and held his head in his hands. Across from him, the Mournival did the same. To say that Ignace Carcassy was not a happy man was an understatement. His lunch was cold, Mercedy Ollerton was late, and the wine he was drinking wasn't fit to lubricate the gears of an engine. To top it all off, his pen tapped on the thick paper of the bondsman No. 7 without any inspiration flowing. He'd taken to avoiding the retreat, partly for fear of running into Wenduin again, but mostly because it just depressed him too much. The vandalism done to the bar lent it an incredibly sad and gloomy aspect, and, while some of the remembrances needed the squalor to inspire their work, Carcassy wasn't one of them. Instead, he relaxed in the subdeck where most of the remembrances gathered for their meals, but which was empty for the better part of the day. The solitude was helping him to deal with all that had happened since he'd challenged Euphrates Keeler about her distributing the Lectitio Divinitatis pamphlets, though it certainly wasn't helping him compose any poetry. She'd been unrepentant when he'd confronted her, urging him to join her in prayer to the God Emperor before some kind of makeshift shrine. "I can't," he had said. "It's ridiculous, Euphrates. Can't you see that?" "What's so ridiculous about it, Ig?" she'd asked. "Think about it. We've embarked upon the greatest crusade known to man. A crusade. A war motivated by religious beliefs." No, he protested. "It's not that at all. We've moved beyond the need for the crutch of religion, Euphrates, And we didn't set out from terror to take a step backwards into such outmoded concepts of belief. It's only by dispelling the clouds and superstitions of religion that we discover truth, reason, and morality.
It's not superstition to believe in a god, Ignace, said Euphrates, holding out another of the Lectitio Divinitatis pamphlets. Look, read this, and then make up your mind.
I don't need to read it, he snapped,
throwing the pamphlet to the deck.
I know what it will say, and I'm not interested.
But you have no idea, Ignace. It's all so clear to me now. Ever since that thing attacked me, I've been hiding. In my billet and in my head, but I realize now that all I had to do was allow the light of the Emperor into my heart, and I would be healed.
Didn't Mercedy and I have anything to do with that? Sneered Carcassy. All those hours we spent with you weeping on our shoulders.
Of course you did, smiled Euphrates, coming forward and placing her hands on his cheeks. That's why I wanted to give you the message and tell you what I'd realized. It's very simple, Ignace. We create our own gods, and the blessed Emperor is the master of mankind.
Create our own gods, said Carcassy,
pulling away from her.
No, my dear. Ignorance and fear create the gods. Enthusiasm and deceit adorn them, and human weakness worships them. It's been the same throughout history. When men destroy their old gods, they find new ones to take their place. What makes you think this is any different?
Because I feel the Emperor's light within me.
Oh, well, I can't argue with that, can I?
Spare me your sarcasm, Ignace, said Euphrates, suddenly hostile. I thought you might be open to hearing the good word, but I can see you're just a close-minded fool. Get out, Ignace. I don't want to see you again. Thus dismissed, he'd found himself outside in the companionway alone, bereft of a friend he'd only just managed to make. That had been the last time she'd spoken to him. He'd seen her only once since then, and she had ignored his greeting. "Lost in thought, Ignace?" asked Mercedy Ollerton, and he looked up in surprise, shaken from his miserable reverie by her sudden appearance.
"Sorry, my dear," he said. "I didn't hear you approach. I was miles away, composing another verse for Captain Loken to misunderstand and Cinderman to discard."
She smiled, instantly lifting his spirits. It was impossible to be too maudlin around Mercedy. She had a way of making a man realize that it was good to be alive. Solitude suits you, Ignace. You're far less susceptible to temptation.
"Oh, I don't know," he said, holding up the bottle of wine. "There's always room in my life for temptation. I count it a bad day if I'm not tempted by something or other."
"You're incorrigible, Ignace," she laughed. "But enough of that. What's so important that you dragged me away from my transcripts to meet here? I want to be up to date by the time the spear tip gets back from the moon." Flustered by her directness, Carcassy wasn't sure where to begin, and thus opted for the softly approach.
"Have you seen Euphrates around recently?"
"I saw her yesterday evening, just before the Stormbirds launched." "Why?"
"Did she seem herself?"
"Yes, I think so. I was a little surprised by the change in her appearance, but she's an imagist. I suppose it's what they do every now and again."
"Did she try to give you anything?"
"Give me anything? No. Look, what's this all about?" Carcassy slipped a battered pamphlet across the table towards Mercedy. Watching her expression change as she read it, and recognized it for what it was. "Where did you get this?" she asked when she'd finished reading it.
"Euphrates gave it to me," he replied. "Apparently she wants to spread the word of the God Emperor to us first, because we helped her when she needed support."
"God Emperor? Has she taken leave of her senses?"
"I don't know. Maybe," he said, pouring himself a drink.
Mercedy pushed over a glass, and he filled that too.
"I don't think she was over her experience in the Whisperheads, even if she made out that she was."
"This is insane," said Mercedy. "She'll have her certification revoked. Did you tell her that?"
"Sort of," said Carcassy. "I tried to reason with her, but you know how it is with those religious types. Never any room for a dissenting opinion."
"And?"
"And nothing. She threw me out of her billet after that."
"So you handled it with your usual tact, then?"
"Perhaps I could have been more delicate," agreed Carcassy. "But I was shaken to know that a woman of intelligence could be taken in by such nonsense."
"So, What do we do about it? You tell me. I don't have a clue. Do you think we should tell someone about Euphrates? Mercedy took a long drink of the wine and said, I think we have to. Any ideas who? Cinderman, maybe? Carcassy sighed. I had a feeling you were going to suggest him. I don't like the man, but he's probably the best bet these days. If anyone can talk Euphrates around, it's an iterator. Mercedy sighed and poured another couple of drinks. Want to get drunk? Now you're talking my language, said Carcassy. They swapped stories and memories of less complicated times for an hour, finishing the bottle of wine and sending a servitor to fetch more when it ran out. By the time they'd drained half the second one, they were already planning a great symphonic work of her documentarist findings embellished with his verse. They laughed and studiously avoided any talk of Euphrates Keeler and the betrayal they were soon to visit upon her. Their thoughts were immediately dispelled as chiming alarm bells rang out, and the corridor beyond began to fill with hurrying people. At first they ignored the noise, but as the number of people grew, they decided to find out what was going on. Picking up the bottle and glasses, Carcassy and Mercedy unsteadily made their way to the hatchway, where they saw a scene of utter bedlam. Soldiers and civilians, remembrancers and ship's crew, were heading for the embarkation decks in a hurry. They saw faces streaked with tears, and huddled, weeping figures, consoling one another in their shared misery. "What's going on?" shouted Carcassy, grabbing a passing soldier. The man rounded on him angrily. "Get off me, you old fool!" "I just want to know what's happening," said Carcassy, shocked at the man's venom. "Haven't you heard?" wept the soldier. "It's all over the ship." "What is?" demanded Mercedy. "The War Master." "What about him? Is he all right?" The man shook his head. "Emperor save us, but the War Master is dead." The bottle slipped from Carcassy's hands, shattering on the floor. And he was instantly sober. The War Master dead. Surely there had to be some kind of mistake. Surely Horus was beyond such concerns as mortality. He faced Mercedy and could see exactly the same thoughts running through her head. The soldier he'd stopped shrugged off his grip and ran down the corridor, leaving the two of them standing there, aghast at such an horrific prospect. "It can't be true," whispered Mercedy. "It just can't be." "I know. There must be some mistake." "What if there isn't?" "I don't know," said Carcassy. "But we have to find out more." Mercedy nodded and waited for him to collect the bondsmen before they joined the hurrying throng as it made its mob-like way towards the embarkation decks. Neither of them spoke during the journey, too busy trying to process the impact of the War Master's death. Carcassy felt the muse stir within him at such weighty subject matter, and tried not to despise the fact that it came at such a terrible time. He spotted the corridor leading to the observation deck adjacent to the launch port from where the Stormbirds could be seen deploying or returning. She resisted his pull until he explained his plan. "There's no way they're going to let us in," said Carcassy, out of breath from his exertions. "We can watch the Stormbirds arrive from here, and there's an observation gantry that overlooks the deck itself." They darted from the human river, making its way to the embarkation deck, and followed the arched corridor that led to the observation deck. Inside the long chamber, the wide armoured glass wall showed smudges of starlight and the glinting hulls of distant bulk cruisers belonging to the Army and the Mechanicum. Below them was the chasm-like opening of the embarkation deck, its blinking locator lights flashing an angry red. Mercedy dimmed the lighting, and the details beyond the glass became clearer. The yellow-brown swell of Davin's moon curved away from them, its surface grimy and smeared with clouds. A hazy corona of sickly light haloed the moon, and, from here, it looked peaceful. "I don't see anything," said Mercedy. Carcassy pressed himself against the glass to eliminate reflections and tried to see something other than himself and Mercedy. Then he saw it. Like a glimmering firefly, a distant speck of fire was rising out of the moon's corona and heading towards the vengeful spirit. "There," he said, pointing towards the approaching light. "Where? Oh, wait, I see it," said Mercedy, blink clicking the image of the approaching craft. Carcassy watched as the light drew nearer, resolving itself into the shape of a speeding stormbird,
as it angled its approach to the embarkation deck. Even though Carcassy was no pilot, he could tell that its approach was recklessly rapid, the craft's wings folding in at the last moment as it aimed for the yawning, red-lit hatch. "Come on," he said, taking Mercedes' hand and leading the way up the steps to the observation gantry. The steps were steep and narrow, and Carcassy had to stop to get his breath back before he reached the top. By the time they reached the gantry, the Stormbird had already been recovered, and its assault ramp was descending. A host of Astartes gathered around the craft as the bell of return began ringing, and 4 warriors emerged, the plates of their armor dented and bloodstained. Between them, they carried a body draped in a Legion banner. Carcassy's breath caught in his throat, and he felt his heart turn to stone at the sight. "The Mournival," said Mercedes. "Oh, no." The 4 warriors were quickly followed by an enormous gurney upon which lay a partially armored warrior of magnificent stature. Even from here, Carcassy could tell that the figure upon the gurney was the War Master, and though tears leapt unbidden to his eyes at the sight of such a superlative warrior laid low, he rejoiced that the shrouded corpse was not the War Master. He heard Mercedes blink-clicking the images, even though he knew there would be no point. Her eyes were similarly misted with tears. Behind the gurney came the Remembrancer woman, Viva, her dress torn and bloody, the fine fabric mud-stained and ragged. But Carcassy pushed her from his mind as he saw more warriors rush towards the gurney. Armored in white plate, they surrounded the War Master as he was wheeled through the embarkation deck with great haste, and Carcassy's heart leapt as he recognized them as Legion apothecaries. "He's still alive," he said. "What? How do you know?" "The apothecaries are still working on him," laughed Carcassy, the relief tasting like the sweetest wine. They threw themselves into each other's arms, embracing with the sheer relief of the War Master's survival. "He's alive," sobbed Mercedes. "I knew he had to be. He couldn't be dead." "No," agreed Carcassy. "He couldn't." They broke apart and sagged against the railings as the Astartes escorted the fallen War Master across the deck. As the huge blast doors rumbled open, the masses of people gathered outside surged through in a great wave, their cries of loss and pain audible even through the armored glass of the observation gantry. "No," whispered Carcassy. "No, no, no." The Astartes were in no mood to be slowed by this mass of people, and brutally clubbed them aside as they forced a path through the crowd. The Mournival led the gurney through the crowds, mercilessly clearing a bloody path through the people before them. Carcassy saw men and women cast down, trampled underfoot, and their screams were pitiful to hear. Mercedes held his arm as they watched the Astartes bludgeon their way from the embarkation deck. They vanished through the blast door and were lost to sight as they rushed towards the medical deck. "Those poor people!" cried Mercedes, sinking to her knees and looking down on a scene like the aftermath of a battle. Wounded soldiers, remembrancers, and civilians lay where they had fallen, bleeding and broken, simply because they were unlucky enough to be in the path of the Astartes. "They didn't care," said Carcassy, still unable to believe the bloody scenes that he'd just witnessed. "They've killed those people. It was like they didn't care." Still in shock at the casual ease with which the Astartes had punched through the crowd, Carcassy gripped the railings, his knuckles white and his jaw clenched with outrage. "How dare they?" he hissed. "How dare they?" His anger at the scenes below still seethed close to the surface. However, he noticed a robed figure making her way through the carnage below, reaching out to the injured and stunned. His eyes narrowed, but he recognized the shapely form of Euphrates Keeler. She was handing out Lectitio Divinitatis pamphlets, and she wasn't alone. Malaghurst watched the recording from the embarkation deck with a grim expression, watching his fellow sons of Horus batter their way through the crowds that swarmed around the War Master's racked body. The pic replayed again on the viewer set into the table in the War Master's sanctum, and each time he watched it, he willed it to be different, but each time the flickering images remained resolutely the same. "How many dead?" asked Hector Varvarus, standing at Malaghurst's shoulder. "I don't have the final figures yet, but at least 21 are dead, and many more are badly injured or won't wake from the comas they're in." He cursed Loken and the others for their heavy-handedness as the image played again, but supposed he couldn't blame them for their ardor. The War Master was in a critical condition, and no one knew if he would live, so their desperation to reach the medical decks was forgivable, even if many might say that their actions were not.
"A bad business, Malachhurst," said Varus needlessly. "The Astartes will not come out of this well."
Malachhurst sighed and said,
"They thought the War Master was dying, and acted accordingly."
"Acted accordingly," repeated Varus. "I do not think many people will accept that, my friend. Once word of this gets out, it will be a crippling blow to morale."
"It will not get out," assured Malachhurst. "I am rounding up everyone who was on that deck, and have shut down all non-command Vox traffic from the ship."
Tall and precise, Hector Varus was rake-thin and angular, and his every movement was calculated. Traits he carried over into his role as Lord Commander of the Army Forces of the 63rd Expedition.
"Trust me, Malachhurst, this will get out. One way or another, it will get out. Nothing remains secret forever. Such things have a habit of wanting to be told, and this will be no different."
"Then what do you suggest, Lord Commander?"
asked Malachhurst.
"Are you genuinely asking me now, or are you just observing a courtesy because I am here?"
"I was genuinely asking,"
said Malachhurst, smiling as he realized that he meant it. Varus was a canny soldier who understood the hearts and minds of mortal men.
"Then you have to tell people what happened. Be honest."
"Heads will need to roll," cautioned Malachhurst. "People will demand blood for this."
"Then give it to them. If that's what it takes, give it to them. Someone has to be seen to pay for this atrocity."
"Atrocity? Is that what we're calling it now?"
"What else would you call it? Astartes warriors have committed murder."
The enormity of what Varus was suggesting staggered Malachhurst, and he lowered himself slowly into one of the chairs at the War Master's table.
"You would have me give up an Astartes warrior for this? I cannot do it."
Varus leaned over the table, the decorations and medals of his dress uniform reflecting like gold suns in its black surface.
"Innocent blood has been spilled, and while I can understand the reasons behind the actions of your men, it changes nothing."
"I can't do it, Hector,"
said Malachhurst, shaking his head. Varus moved to stand next to him.
"You and I both swore the oath of loyalty to the Imperium, did we not?"
"We did. But what has that to do with anything?"
The old general locked eyes with Malachhurst and said,
"We swore that we would uphold the ideals of nobility and justice that the Imperium stands for. Yes?"
"Yes, but this is different. There were extenuating circumstances."
"Irrelevant," snapped Varus. "The Imperium must stand for something, or it stands for nothing. If you turn away from this, then you betray that oath of loyalty. Are you willing to do that, Malachhurst?"
Before he could answer, there was a soft knocking on the glass of the sanctum, and Malachhurst turned to see who disturbed them. Ingmay Singh, mistress of astropathy, stood before them like a skeletal ghost in a hooded white robe, the upper portions of her face shrouded in shadows.
"Mistress Singh,"
said Varus, bowing deeply towards the telepath.
"Lord Varus," she replied,
her voice soft and feather-light. She returned the Lord Commander's bow, and despite her blindness, inclined her head in precisely the right direction, a talent that never failed to unnerve Malachhurst.
"What is it, Mistress Singh?"
he asked, though, in truth, he was glad of the interruption.
"I bring tidings that must concern you, Sire Malachhurst,"
she said, turning her blind gaze upon him.
"The astropathic choirs are unsettled. They sense a powerful surge in the currents of the warp. Powerful and growing."
"What does that mean?"
he asked.
"That the veil between worlds grows thin,"
said Ingmay Singh. 10. Apothecarian. Prayers. Confession. Stripped out of his armor and wearing bloody surgical robes, Vadon was as close to desperate as he had ever been in his long experience as an apothecary of the sons of Horus. The War Master lay before him on the gurney, his flesh exposed to his knives and to the probes of the Medicae machines. Oxygen was fed to the War Master through a mask, and saline drips pumped fluids into his body in an attempt to normalize his blood pressure. Medicae servitors brought fresh blood for immediate transfusions, and the entire theatre fizzed with tension and frantic activity. "We're losing him," shouted Apothecary Logan, watching the heart monitors. "Blood pressure is dropping rapidly, heart rate spiking. He's going to arrest." "Damn it," cursed Vadden. "Get me more Laraman serum. His blood won't clot. And fix up another fluid line." A whirring surgical narthecium swung down from the ceiling, multiple limbs clattering as they obeyed Vadden's shouted commands. Fresh Laraman cells were pumped directly into Horus's shoulder, and the bleeding slowed, though Vadden could see it still wasn't stopping completely. Thick needles jabbed into the War Master's arms, filling him with super-oxygenated blood, but their supply was dwindling faster than he would have believed possible. "Stabilizing," breathed Logan. "Heart rate slowing, and blood pressure is up." "Good," said Vadden. "We've got some breathing room, then." "He can't take much more of this," said Logan. "We're running out of things we can do for him." "I'll not hear that in my theatre, Logan," snapped Vadden. "We're not going to lose him." The War Master's chest hiked as he clung to life, his breathing coming in short, hyperventilating gasps, more blood pumping from the wound in his shoulder. Of the two wounds the War Master had suffered, it seemed the least severe, but Vadden knew it was the one that was killing him. The puncture wound in his chest had practically healed already, ultrasonograms showing that his lung had sealed itself off from the pulmonary system while it repaired itself. The War Master's secondary lungs were sustaining him for now. The Mournival hovered like expectant fathers as the apothecaries worked harder than they had ever worked before. Vadden had never expected to have the War Master for a patient. The Primarch's biology was as far beyond that of a normal Astartes warrior as his own was from a mortal man, and Vadden knew that he was out of his depth. Only the Emperor himself had the knowledge to delve into the body of a Primarch with confidence, and the enormity of what was occurring was not lost on him. A green light winked into life on the Narthecium machine, and he lifted the data slate from the port in its silver steel surface. Numbers and text scrolled across its glossy surface, and though much of it made no sense to him, he felt his spirits fall as what he could comprehend sank in. Seeing that the War Master was stable, he circled the operating slab and joined the Mournival, wishing he had better news for them. "What's wrong with him?" demanded Abaddon. "Why is he still lying there?" "Honestly, First Captain, I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" shouted Abaddon, grabbing Vadden and slamming him against the theatre wall. Silver trays laden with scalpels, saws, and forceps clattered to the tiled floor. "Why don't you know?" Loken and Aximand grappled with the First Captain as Vadden felt Abaddon's enormous strength slowly crushing his neck. "Let go of him, Ezekiel," cried Loken. "This isn't helping." "You won't let him die," snarled Abaddon, and Vadden was amazed to see a terrible fear in the First Captain's eyes. "He is the War Master." "You think I don't know that?" gasped Vadden as the others prized Abaddon's grip from his neck. He slid down the wall, already able to feel the swelling in his bruised throat. "Emperor damn you if you let him die," hissed Abaddon, stalking the theatre with predatory strides. "If he dies, I will kill you." Aximand led the First Captain away from him, speaking soothing words as Loken and Torgaden helped him to his feet. "The man's a maniac," hissed Vadden. "Get him out of my theatre now." "He's not himself, Apothecary," explained Loken. "None of us are." "Just keep him away from my team, Captain," warned Vadden. "He's not in control of himself, and that makes him dangerous."
"We will," Torgaden promised him. "Now what can you tell us? Will he survive?"
Vadden took a moment to compose himself before answering, picking up his fallen data slate. "As I said before, I just don't know. We're like children trying to repair a logic engine that's been dropped from orbit. We don't understand even a fraction of what his body is capable of or how it works. I can't even begin to guess what kind of damage it suffered to have caused this."
"What's actually happening to him?" asked Loken.
"It's the wound in his shoulder. It won't clot. It's bleeding out and we can't stop it. We found some degraded genetic residue in the wound that might be some kind of poison, but I can't be sure."
"Might it be a bacteriological or viral infection?" asked Torgaden. The water on Davin's moon was thick with contaminants. I ought to know. I swallowed a flagon's worth of it.
No, said Vadden. The War Master's body is, for all intents and purposes, immune to such things.
Then what is it?
This is a guess, but it looks like this particular poison induces a form of anemic hypoxia. Once it enters the bloodstream, it's absorbed exponentially by the red blood cells, in preference to oxygen. With the War Master's accelerated metabolism, the toxin was carried efficiently around his system, damaging his tissue cells as it went, so they were unable to make proper use of the reduced oxygen content.
So, where did it come from? Asked Loken. I thought you said the War Master was immune to such things.
And so he is. But this is like nothing I've ever seen before. It's as though it's been specifically designed to kill him. It's got precisely the right genetic camouflage to fool his enhanced biological defenses and allow it to do the maximum amount of damage. It's a Primarch killer, pure and simple.
So, how do we stop it?
This isn't an enemy you can take a bolter or a sword to, Captain Loken. It's a poison, he said. If I knew the source of the poisoning, we might be able to do something.
Then, if we found the weapon that did this, would that be of some help? Asked Loken.
Seeing the desperate need for hope in the captain's eyes, Vadden nodded.
Maybe. From the wound shape, it looks like a stab wound from a sword. If you can retrieve the blade, then maybe we can do something for him.
I'll find it, swore Loken.
He turned from Vadden and made his way to the theatre door.
You're going back there?
Asked Torgadden, running to catch up with him.
Yes, and don't try to stop me, warned Loken. Stop you? Said Torgadden. Don't be such a drama queen, Garvey. I'm coming with you.
Recovering a Titan after action in the field was a long and arduous process, full of technical, logistical, and manual difficulties. Entire fleets of vessels came down from orbit, bringing huge lifters, enormous diggers and loading machines. The delivery vessels had to be dug from their impact craters, and an army of mechanicum servitors were required to facilitate the process. Titus Cassar was exhausted. He'd spent the better part of the day prepping the Titan for its recovery, and everything was in readiness for their return to the fleet. Until they were recovered, there wasn't much to do except wait, and that had become the hardest part of all for the men left behind on Davin's moon. With time to wait, there was time to think, and with time to think, the human mind could conjure all manner of things from the depths of its imagination. Titus still couldn't believe that Horus had fallen. A being of such power, like unto a Titan himself, was not meant to fall in battle. He was invincible, the son of a god. In the shadow of the Dies Irae, Titus fished out his Lectitio Divinitatis chapbook and, once he was satisfied he was alone, began to read the words there. The badly printed scripture gave him comfort, turning his mind to the glory of the divine Emperor of mankind.
O Emperor, who is Lord, and God above us all, hear me in this hour of need. Your servant lies with death's cold touch upon him, and I ask you to turn your beneficent gaze his way.
He fished out a pendant from beneath his uniform jacket as he read. It was a delicately wrought thing of silver and gold that he'd had one of the blank-faced servitors fashion for him. A silver capital I, with a golden starburst at its centre. It represented hope and the promise of a better future. He held it clasped to his breast as he recited more of the words of the Lectitio Divinitatis, feeling a familiar warmth suffuse him as he repeated the words. Titus sensed the presence of other people behind him a second too late, and turned to see Jonah Arukan and a group of the Titan's crew. Like him, they were dirty and tired after the fight against the monsters of this place. But unlike him, they did not have faith. Guiltily, he closed his chapbook and waited for Jonah's inevitable barb. No one said anything, and as he looked closer, he saw a brittle edge of sorrow and the need for comfort in the faces of the men before him. "Titus," said Jonah Arukin, that is the War Master. We wondered if—" Titus smiled in welcome as he understood what they'd come for. He opened his chapbook again and said, "Let us pray, brothers." The medical deck was a sterile, gleaming wilderness of tiled walls and brushed steel cabinets, a warren of soulless glass rooms and laboratories. Petronella had completely lost all sense of direction, bewildered by the hasty summons that had brought her from the moon's surface back to the vengeful spirit. Passing through the bloody embarkation deck, she saw that the upper levels of the ship were in pandemonium, as word of the War Master's death had spread from vessel to vessel with all the fearsome rapidity of an epidemic. Malaghurst the Twisted had issued a fleet-wide communique denying that the War Master was dead, but hysteria and paranoia had a firm head start on his words. Riots had taken hold aboard several ships, as doomsayers and demagogues had arisen, proclaiming that these were now the end times. Army units had been ruthlessly quashing such malcontents, but more sprang up faster than they could stop them. It had been scant hours since the War Master's fall, but the 63rd Expedition was already beginning to tear itself apart without him. Maggard followed Petronella, his wounds bound and sealed with sin skin by a Legion apothecary on the journey back to the War Master's flagship. His skin still had an unhealthy pallor, and his armor was dented and torn, but he was alive and magnificent. Maggard was only an indentured servant, but he had impressed her, and she resolved to treat him with the respect his talents deserved. A helmeted Astartes warrior led her through the confusing maze of the Medicae deck, eventually indicating that she should enter a nondescript white door marked with a winged staff wrapped in a pair of twisting serpents. Maggard opened the door for her, and she entered a gleaming operating theatre, its circular walls covered to waist height in green enamelled tiles. Silver cabinets and hissing, pumping machines surrounded the War Master, who lay on the operating slab with a tangled web of tubes and wires attached to his flesh. A stool of gleaming metal sat next to the slab. Medicae servitors lurked around the circumference of the room, set into niches around the wall, and a gurgling machine suspended above the War Master fed fluid and blood into his body. Her eyes misted to see the War Master brought so low, and tears came at this violation of the natural order of things. A giant Astartes warrior in hooded surgical robes approached her and said, "My name is Apothecary Vadden, Miss Vivar." She brushed her hands across her eyes, conscious of how she must look, her dress torn and caked with mud, her eyes blackened with smudged makeup. She started to hold her hand out for a kiss, but realized how foolish that would be, and simply nodded. "I am Petronella Vivar," she managed. "I am the War Master's documentarist." "I know," said Vadden. "He asked for you by name." Sudden hope flared in her breast. "He's awake." Vadden nodded. "He is. If it was up to me, you would not be here now. But I do not disobey the word of the commander, and he desires to speak with you." "How is he?" she asked. The apothecary shook his head. "He fades in and out of lucidity, so do not expect too much of him. If I decide it is time for you to leave, then you leave. Do you understand me?" "I do," she said. "But please, may I speak with him now?" Vadden seemed reluctant to let her near the War Master, but moved aside and let her pass. She nodded her thanks and took a faltering step towards the operating slab, eager to see the War Master, but afraid of what she might find. Petronella's hand leapt to her mouth to stifle an involuntary gasp at the sight of him. The War Master's cheeks were sunken and hollow, his eyes dull and listless. Grey flesh hung from his skull, wrinkled and ancient-looking, and his lips were the blue of a corpse.
"Do I look that bad?"
asked Horace, his voice rasping and distant.
"No," she stammered. "Not at all. I—"
"Don't lie to me, Miss Vivar. If you're to hear my valediction, then there must be no deceit between us."
"Valediction? No, I won't. You have to live."
"Believe me, there's nothing I'd like more," he wheezed. "But Vadden tells me there's not much chance of that. And I don't intend to leave this life without a proper legacy. A record that says the things that must be said before the end."
"Sir, your deeds alone stand as an eternal legacy. Please don't ask this of me."
Horace coughed a froth of blood onto his chest. gathering his strength before speaking once more, and his voice was the strong and powerful one she remembered. "You told me that it was your vocation to immortalize me, to record the glory of Horus for future generations, did you not?" "I did," she sobbed. "Then do this last thing for me, Miss Viva," he said. She swallowed hard and then fished out the data slate and Nemo quill from her reticule, before sitting on the high stool next to the operating slab. "Very well," she said at last. "Let's start at the beginning."
"It was too much," began Horus. "I promised my father I would make no mistakes, and now we have come to this."
"Mistakes?" asked Petronella, though she suspected she knew the War Master's meaning.
"Temba, giving him lordship over Davin," said Horus. "He begged me not to leave him behind, claimed it was too much for him. I should have listened, but I was too eager to be away on some fresh conquest."
"Temba's weakness is not your fault, sir," she said.
"It is good of you to say that, Miss Viva, but I appointed him," said Horus. "The responsibility lies with me. Throne, Gilliman will laugh when he hears of this. Him and the lion both. They will say I was not fit to be War Master since I could not read the hearts of men."
"Never," cried Petronella. "They wouldn't dare."
"Oh, they will, girl, believe me. We are brothers, yes, but like all brothers we squabble and seek to outdo one another."
Petronella could think of nothing to say, the idea of the superhuman Primarchs squabbling quite beyond her.
"They were jealous, all of them," continued Horus. "When the Emperor named me War Master, it was all some of them could do to congratulate me. Angron especially. He was a wild one, and even now I can barely keep him in check. Gilliman wasn't much better. I could tell he thought it should have been him."
"They were jealous of you?" asked Petronella, unable to believe what the War Master was telling her. The Nemo quill scratching across the data slate in response to her thoughts.
"Oh, yes," nodded Horus bitterly. "Only a few of my brothers were gracious enough to bow their heads and mean it. Lorgar, Mortarion, Sanguinius, Fulgrim, and Dawn. They are true brothers. I remember watching the Emperor's Stormbird leaving Ulanor and weeping to see him go. But most of all, I remember the knives I felt in my back as he went. I could hear their thoughts as clearly as though they spoke them aloud. Why should I, Horus, be named War Master when there were others more worthy of the honor?"
"You were made War Master because you were the most worthy, sir," said Petronella.
"No," said Horus. "I was not. I was simply the one who most embodied the Emperor's need at the time. You see, for the first 3 decades of the Great Crusade, I fought alongside the Emperor, and I alone felt the full weight of his ambition to rule the galaxy. He passed that vision to me, and I carried it with me in my heart as we forged our path across the stars. It was a grand adventure we were on. System after system reunited with the master of mankind. You cannot imagine what it was like to live in such times, Miss Viva."
"It sounds magnificent."
"It was," said Horus. "It was.